financial regulatory reform. And there's an idea that neither of you touched on. I was kind of curious what your thoughts were, which is rather than take the approach of a bank levy or capital requirements to essentially take and cap the size of banks within at least the United States to a certain percentage of U.S. GDP. And the argument is that a lot of the bank growth, which has taken place since, roughly speaking, the end of the Clinton administration, took place under the guise that size and scale was needed to provide services to clients across a broad range of products. But the reality is that you can do that those same types of services through a series of medium-sized banks rather than these large colossal banks. So I want to see what your thoughts were on that. Thank you.
Well, if you take away the implicit and explicit taxpayer subsidies that these banks basically had in the 90s when Secretary Rubin was putting together Citibank, you know, that would accomplish the same thing without having a heavy hand of some kind of a cap passed into U.S. law, I think.
I agree with the point that having only smaller banks would not impose a big efficiency cost on the U.S. economy. Smaller banks can loan to smaller companies, and bigger companies borrow on bond markets. But I didn't bring the subject up because it's another one of those Walter Mitty moments in my political judgment, such as it is sitting 3,000 miles outside the Beltway. I don't think that we will be able to break up the big banks. I think they're too politically powerful to be dismantled, but on the margin we can do things to discourage them from growing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have some other questions out here for the points? Yes.
Claude Barfield, AEI. I'd like to go back to the sort of the theme here about Korea and what the G20 can do under Korea's leadership, and ask you the larger question, but it will affect Korea right away, because how do you measure success? That is Korea's successful leadership? And I keep thinking about the way you will describe the bank tax playing out, and other issues where you've got the most critical issues. I don't think it's nice to have the developing country. Everybody is in favor of expanding G8 to the G20, but to have the new countries there. But I think it makes it less likely that you will get consensus on issues. And whether it's the bank tax or whether it's how you end the Doha round or the other issues that the G20 has dealt with, it seems to be much more difficult to get consensus. But it also seems to me it brings up the larger question of what do we expect from the G20? I think it is a mistake, just as it was with the G8, 7 or G8, to say that this is in any sense a governing body that actually can make decisions. It is enough. Let me just put it in the starkest terms. I think there is a public good to, whether it was the G7 or the G20, the leaders getting together. But I think you lead to really false expectations that are going to lead to deep disappointments if you go much beyond that, because the G20 is not a decision-making body. And in most cases, I think, even with the best of wills, you're not going to find nations willing to agree to this as a part of something that they would feel either legally or morally bound to do on big economic and social decisions.
I agree.
I agree with a couple of caveats, which is that even if the G20 is mainly a consensus-building and confidence-building forum rather than a decision-making forum, that doesn't make it unimportant. I think consensus. Yeah. So I'm just clarifying. I don't think we disagree. I didn't hear you arguing for abolishing the G20, but for being realistic about what it is capable of achieving and what we should expect of it. It's one of a series of venues in which these kind of issues are discussed. So the trade side is discussed in the G20, in the WTO, and elsewhere. The financial side is discussed in Basel and wherever the G20 happens to be meeting. Those are all part of a process. If there are issues on which there has to be a degree of consensus or agreement in order to move forward, that's where it will be attained. How exactly are we going to judge the success of the Korean chairmanship, I suppose, against the criteria that they themselves set. So they described the bank tax and the financial reform agenda as kind of central to what they wanted to achieve. How much are they going to succeed in achieving over the course of the year?
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi there, Bill Behrens from GE Capital. And Dr. Eichengreen, I appreciate your presentation. And in particular, I have questions on the Korea side of the bank tax and almost the genesis of their position. Because, you know, our reading in the last few months had indicated that they seemed initially, let's say in the early part of this year, opposed. Now we've seen kind of through, I think Professor Shin, is it, from Princeton, moving in this other direction. So just a little background there just for would be really helpful for me. And secondarily, could you outline the difference between their approach to bank tax when you say, you know, non-core liabilities vis-a-vis kind of the U.S. financial responsibility tax? Kind of walk me through that, and then if possible, sorry, it's a long question, maybe even touch on if there's an extraterritorial component to that, the way there is with the U.S. TARP tax.
So there is a moral hazard for professors to give too much credit to professors. So I'm not in the room. I'm tempted to say Professor Shin has been influential in shaping the Korean government's policy on these issues. It is the case that his prior academic work was focused squarely on issues like leverage and liquidity and the operation of the interbank market. So I see what has come out of the Korean government since February as very much consistent with his prior work. So on that basis, you have all the information I have now to think about what has driven the process. On the different tax ideas, I think in the United States, I really understand the bank tax idea as taxing bank size, as I said before, but you all have been following this debate and will have your interpretation as well. I see the non-core liability tax as a way of dealing indirectly with bank size and directly with liquidity risk, which was a big problem in the crisis and remains a big problem. And finally, you asked about extraterritorial, which is code for banks like Citigroup are going to be borrowing not only on our interbank market, but...
Well, for example, in the U.S., you respond to the idea that a foreign bank above $50 million is still responsible for the U.S. TARP tax. So that, you know, again, so UBS, et cetera. And I'm wondering if there's something similar to the Korean.
Right. So that's another way of putting the point about if this is going to work, there's got to be a reasonable degree of different countries moving together.
My name is Kyung from Korean Embassy. I think G-20 has very successfully responded to the global economic crisis, and then these four issues you mentioned is financial regulatory reform. That issues has been long discussed from the 2008 from first Washington G20 summit. But I wonder, we have two summits in June in Canada, in November in Seoul. What could be agreed in this area? Because G20 has successfully responded to economic crisis, and then many people say that because G20 has got very concrete results in terms of financial governance reform, and then reform of international financial institution. So I wonder what could be discussed and what could be we can get in June and November summit.